Some while ago I made a video about Chinese butterfly swords, and you can see a little bit of it here. And I have today been looking everywhere in my house to find those padded practice LARP, if you like, butterfly swords that I made myself, and nope, they're just gone. I moved house about 10 months ago, and in common with my 15th century mace, my best hiking boots, which I just had resold, and all the pictures that formed the background in my last house, you know, the background to my videos, you know, all those photographs of things in the jungle, and there was James Cosmo and various other bits. I packed them all very carefully because they were important to me, and then they, like it seems, my padded Chinese butterfly swords, they just sublimed. But an Antipodean viewer of mine took pity on me and sent from the other side of the planet these. And of course I was itching to try them out. So these, as you can hear, are solid metal ones. And so I could use these against a HEMA opponent with also a blunt but otherwise solid and realistic weighted sword. And so that is what I did. Now I'm about to show you some footage of my trying these out against longsword, arming sword and the like, against HEMA skilled opponents using HEMA padded kit. Just a few words of caution. The first is that I'm very rusty. I haven't actually practiced with these for many years, and I had to get out the old Hong Kong book of Kung Fu to remind myself of some of the moves. And thus reminded, I then gave it a whirl. Another thing to bear in mind is that this was at the end of the COVID-19 lockdown, and I hadn't done any exercise to speak of for about 2 years. Normally I go dancing twice a week. Well, dancing all shut down, and I cycle everywhere, but there was nowhere I needed to cycle to, and for me it's not a sport, it's just transport. So yes, I was monumentally unfit and very, very rusty, and just compound things, this was at the end of quite a long day's shooting, and it was a scorching hot day in which we were fighting in thickly padded kit, and so we were all really tired and weary by the time we got round to this. So what you're about to see is not people at their peak. I should also say that even at my peak, I wouldn't say that I was a master of Wing Chun butterfly swords. I was just borderline competent is about as far as I would take it. But anyway, let's see how I got on.
And we're off. I square up to him and adopt the Wing Chun fighting posture. Zach has a much longer weapon, and so my problem is how to close with him. Once I have closed, one would hope that 2 swords beat 1, but I slip and get bonked on the head, so that didn't go well. I think we can score that one to HEMA. I'm looking at my opponent Zach between the swords in front of me, each held at a different distance to cover more possibilities.
Fingertip. Yeah. Any hits better than
Being a bit generous again, 1 to HEMA. Now I'm leading with my left, but I'm right-handed and generally feel that I'm quicker and more assured, leading with my right. I swap back. Now I mostly get it right. I advance while dealing with his attack and keep going so that I win the race and chop him in the torso.
Fairly solid, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, you do get an afterblow, but I think... Yeah.
Let's see that again. I'm waiting for him to make his move, and you can see that my right leg is a tempting target. I read the start of his attack and start advancing early into my block. There's the block, and at the same time I'm chopping at his wrist with my other sword. I press the attack, keeping contact with his sword, with my right sword, while he tries to pull it away to escape. I follow his movement and bring my left sword to a blocking position and hit him in the body with my right sword, which was free to thrust forward as soon as he withdrew his sword from it, which is a classic Wing Chun principle. Having achieved this killing blow, or rather having scored a hit in a friendly bout of sparring, I then relax and bring my left sword down, and he scores a weak afterblow, but I'm racking that one up to Kung Fu, so now it's just 2-1 to HEMA. He goes for a high, threatening guard straight out of the HEMA treatises. Nice metal-on-metal clang there. I leave my leg a bit vulnerable, and he almost snipes it. I think I'll score this next one as a double.
Whoa! Okay. Slash, yeah, but quarter of a second later you hit me on the head, so...
I think that's what I was thinking, a lot of doubles. It's really difficult to control both weapons and not having an easy time of it.
Again in slow motion. He gets a bit too close, and I'm able to knock his point aside, but I'm too rubbish and unfit to follow up, so nothing comes of this. He then comes in with an attack that seems to be an adaptation for coping with my style. You can see that this first attack is weak and easily yields to my parry, and he starts to bring his sword back and round for the real attack. I block at first with my right-hand sword, which then slips off and is free to cut him across the belly, but my block with my left hand against his continuing attack is poor, and he is able to slip off over the top of it and land a decent hit. My hit was about 9 frames before his. That's 9/25ths of a second, slightly over a third of a second. But in a real fight, I couldn't rely on my blows being hefty enough to knock the wind out of his attack. Double. Now, up to this point, I hadn't been having trouble defending my legs and had become a bit complacent, and I ascribed this next hit to that complacency. Watching the footage back, though, I have to add that though I did badly flat-foot myself as I advanced, it is also the case that Zach's timing is very, very good. Now, see that he has launched his attack and is advancing, and I too am advancing to counterattack. By the time his sword lands here, hitting the guard on my right sword, he has already realized that he's in trouble and is in retreat. I use both swords to control his and try to close the distance. He has plenty of flat open space behind him and is able to pull his sword out of my entrapment before I can get to range, and then he counterattacks. But I'm at a better distance now, and I use both my swords to block his hard blow and then press forward and score a hit. Again, at this point I relax and don't bother to defend myself against his afterblow. In a real fight, my hit would have been a hard stab, but here I did a gentle slash because we're friends.
Oh, sorry, I stopped. It's all very messy, isn't it?
Yeah.
We both recall a few guard positions. In my case, they are of little practical use here, save potentially some intimidation or confusion. This time, I'm able to tangle up his sword good and proper, and I'm in quickly and chopping away.
I got him that time.
Back one more?
Yeah.
And I've evened the score.
Oh.
This is different. To be honest, I think half-swording is an inappropriate technique here. His reach and tip speed were his two main advantages. I close in, he draws a dagger. 2 swords versus 1 dagger is not a fair fight.
Very messy.
3-4. Now against arming sword and buckler. A very light tap on my mask's bib, and it seems that I, at the same time, chop him on the wrist. But at the time, I gave him the hit, so let's go with that. 4 all. Now, watching the footage, it seems that neither of us hits here, but that's apparently not what I thought at the time.
Okay, slash across the belly. You caught just sort of the material here.
That's odd. Did you see the hits? Let's watch again in slow motion. Just there, you can see the point of Zach's sword has just clipped the outside of the thickly padded jacket next to my elbow, and then, oh yes, I do chop him quite definitely in the side there, and then draw across his belly. So, how do we score that? My hit is definitely later, but much more solid. Oh, call it a double.
I don't think either of us hit the other there. Now there are actually fancy moves like that, which I did actually hit him, but he got me first.
We both hit. I'm not counting that. It wasn't a serious attempt.
Yes! Across the belly.
Well, I seem pretty pleased with myself. Let's look in detail, though. I deal with his thrust with my right sword, then step in as he withdraws his sword. I bring my left sword up to defend and chop into his side and draw my sword across his belly, but then bonk, you see his sword hit me very near its hilt a bit later. To do this, he had to push his right forearm into the blade of my left sword, but if his arm were armoured, that might be fine. If I were not wearing a helmet, how bad would his blow have been? Not fatal, I'd say, but I'd have a great scar on my forehead to boast about. One to me? A double? Who's to say? Now, arming sword on its own against me.
Whoa!
Nearly. Drat. One to him. No.
Got caught to my own sword.
Very definite hit.
Yeah, my own sword got caught to me there.
I press the attack, and perhaps he is too tired to run full tilt backwards. You can see that I have the advantage as long as I can keep in contact with his sword.
Hit.
Oh, blast it.
That was terrible. Yes!
Zach gives me a chance to push his sword across his centre line, and I advance and score. Classic Wing Chun. Six all to play for.
I think that was a hit.
Yes, looking back at the footage frame by frame, I can see that his sword clashed against mine and bent just enough for its tip to touch the bib on the side of my mask.
I think I've been done.
Oh, okay.
Harry now takes over as my opponent, and I pointlessly display a couple of guard positions. A double?
My ribs. Yeah, but there was also...
I think that was more or less the cross guard.
Oh, was it right?
Yeah, I was trying to do that, but I ended up just doing that.
Harry is being generous. Let's check what he said. Yes, it seems that I'm landing a solid hit to his side, while he is punching his hilt into my other hand and getting me in the head with the crossguard. I rush at him and keep going, and he sort of gives up and turns away, and so I appear to win, but looking at the footage frame by frame, I see that as I chop at him at the end with my right sword, I touch his sword there on the way in. His body language signals defeat, and my hit was much more powerful, so one to me, but not a clean victory. It seems to me that he froze a bit there, perhaps intimidated by the unfamiliar weapon combo.
Cut, yeah. Just for the demonstration for the camera. That's the sort of the classic defence, which I haven't actually pulled off yet, but that's the classic defence against one-handed sword. Wait for him to hack, block with one, cut the wrist with the other.
Right.
True, but my foes here have not made it so easy for me. He was very slow to retreat there.
Slicey.
I'm probably the fresher of the pair of us.
Yeah, but
Got the inside
elbow
of
as well, double.
my arm.
Yes, a clear double. My hit was to the torso and his to an arm, which might count for something, but even so, a definite double. Oh, I should have charged in there.
Oh, that was too slow. I was too slow. I had a great opening there and
There's no force to that.
hesitated.
There's no force to that whatsoever. I just kind of pulled it.
So, did someone score? Let's check the slow-mo. I block his chop to my left side, his sword has come to a halt, but then I lose contact with his sword with both of mine. You see them slip off above, and as I go to chop him, this leaves his sword free to do a draw cut across my belly. My chop hits him in the right upper arm. I think I'll give him the point. The sun comes out.
Oh, yeah, that was a hit. I had the right idea, but I was just a tiny bit hesitant.
Yes, he caught me napping with a quick, well-timed thrust. Again, I miss a good chance to charge in. They are precious. I do charge, and he doesn't know what to
You're
do.
going to run away, you have to bring your sword up.
In a real fight, I think he would at least have swung wildly and hoped, which would have been a big problem for me. In and choppy chop. Same again, but not as clean.
You've got your hand up there, so though it was a hit, I think it was a very weak hit.
But the frame by frame suggests he was too late. I hit there, then his hand arrives. So, what happened there? It seemed so obvious to me at the time that I didn't say. His attack comes in, but it was a feint, and he pulls it short. I have fallen for the feint and miss with both my swords. He drops his sword, hoping presumably to make some attack on my right side, but I both defend myself and attack him by slamming both blades down into his arm before he can enact his plan. If he had a plan. Kung Fu has now pulled ahead a fair bit, but I don't think it was a coincidence that when I was fighting Zach, the teacher, I wasn't doing so well.
Yeah, don't block with your hand.
Again, he gives up under pressure and I chop in, but watching it back carefully, I see that the tip of his sword did touch my leg just there before I knocked it aside. So I'm giving this one to HEMA.
Slice.
I make contact, stay in contact, move his sword aside and sweep up and score. You might call it binding and winding if you are a HEMA buff, but this form involves one sword's taking over from the other.
1, 2, 3, 4.
My movements get a bit wild here and I get caught out.
Yeah, I'm fine. Actually, I lost you in the sun that time.
I noticed I got a. That was a really cute one.
Yeah, wrist.
Did you see what happened there? Neither did I, it seems, but I see it clearly enough now. Too lazy to change the camera angle, I am still staring into the sun. He opens with another flourishing feint, but this time I can see that something isn't right and I back off. He then tries to use his sword's longer reach and tries a rising cut, but I block it very cleanly with my right sword and hit myself in the wrist with my left sword. Should HEMA score a point? Yes, because of Kung Fu incompetence. And on this last one, Harry again tries an opening flourishing feint, and I go to block it and he whisks his sword out of the way, leaving himself totally undefended. Following standard Wing Chun practice, I then thrust ahead from my centre line and chop him on his centre line in the chest, while he goes around the outside and chops me there, on the leg. This is a good way to score a double against me, but not a great way to stay alive.
Okay, double. Right, I think the point is made.
So, it seems that against a competent HEMA practitioner, Kung Fu-wielded butterfly swords can actually hold their own. But before I go much further into this discussion, which is coming, believe me, I feel out of fairness to my sponsor that I ought to say a few words about, well, Audible. That's my sponsor. Now, of course you've heard of Audible. If you say that you haven't heard of Audible, you're just pretending and frankly fooling no one. And that's not behaviour which I admire. No, Audible, it's the world's most enormous purveyor of spoken language recordings on the net. So there you go, that's Audible. Yeah. Okay, so now, Audible, yes. Now, Audible, they sell audio books, of course, and you can hear those read out by famous people or by the original authors or by people who are professional audiobook readers at a speed of your choosing as you, I don't know, cycle into work or do whatever it is that you do using those devices that you have, those ones. But they have more than that. They also have Audible Originals, and if you're a member of Audible, you get all of those for free. And I typed in, for instance, Kung Fu. Well, in the context of this video, you would, wouldn't you? And one of the things that popped up was a series of podcasts, 42 episodes of something called Kung Fu Life. and you can listen to those at your leisure, should you become a member. I also typed in HEMA, because you never know. It turns out that some people are actually called HEMA and they've written books, but you know, HEMA as in Historical European Martial Arts. I came up with another podcast, 91 episodes in German of something called Schwertgeflüster. Schwertgeflüster. Sword whisper, I think, literally. You might say sword whisperer, sword whispers, perhaps if you were going to freely translate into English. But anyway, so you could listen to all 91 episodes of that if you speak German, of course. But on Audible, even if you don't speak German, you can still listen to those episodes. You just won't understand them. Now, how could you try out this site? I imagine some of you are imagining, well, you could go to audible.com/Lindybeige, or you could click the thing in the description, the link in the description, which is quicker. Or if you're the sort of person who likes doing this, you can text Lindybeige to 500 500 and then get details of a 30-day free trial, and then you can roam the site, download an audio book, which is yours to keep forever, even if you never become a member. It's yours, and then you can listen to Audible originals. Here are some Audible originals. They're things that are originated by Audible and they're only available on the Audible site. And then should you become a member, you pay a monthly fee and you get more stuff, more audiobooks and more access to podcasts and, oh, you know, all that. I typed in sword fight. Because, again, in this context, well, you would, and I came up with He Who Fights with Monsters. It's a book, and it's 29 hours long. That's one. So in terms of hours for your quid, that's one hell of a bargain. But it's subtitled a lit RPG, and I thought, a lit RPG? What's that? I didn't know. I had to Google for it, because I didn't know what a lit RPG is. And I also listened to a bit of a sample, which you can do. Any audiobook you're considering buying, you can listen to a little sample of it. And it's like a new form of novel. It is a novel, it's written out in nice prose and so forth, read out as a novel. But the main protagonist of the novel is someone who is, if you like, playing a game. You imagine a fully immersive computer game, because you know there are loads of people out there who love playing first-person computer games, adventure games, and it's a novel written from that perspective. There you go, lit RPG. It takes all sorts to make a world, doesn't it? But there you go. You could listen to He Who Fights with Monsters for 29 hours and all for free. Oh, why don't you just click the thing in the description? Now I should get on with. So thank you, Audible. But I should. Oh, by the way, if you do go to one of my sponsors, by going audible.com/Lindybeige or texting Lindybeige to, that is a way to support the channel, because then the people at Audible know that you got there via my particular link, and so they know that, that these adverts actually work, and so maybe they'll sponsor me again, which is good, because in the future I intend to do some of my own Audible books, audio books, and they may appear on Audible, so who knows? Right, so yes, against a longsword, it seems that I was holding my own. And Zach, I think, won slightly more than half the bouts. But the fact that a guy who was using these weapons for the first time in his life, and only having used a simulacrum of them, the padded version, many years before, so he was very rusty, can hold his own against someone who's younger and fitter and a really keen HEMA practitioner who frankly cheats by practicing and training and stuff, and the fact that I was able to hold my own, I think is proof that these are feasible weapons. They do work, can be made to work. Now, if I were to fight Zach, say, in a lift, and he's got a longsword, that's elevator to you rebel scum, then, oh yeah, I would definitely choose these, because in a lift I can move these quite happily, but the size of the small room we're in would really hamper his movements with the long sword, and so yes, in that environment, definitely butterfly swords I would pick every time. But of course, in the context of this video, I was only trying out these weapons as a duelist. What about multiple opponents? Yeah, against multiple opponents, long weapons are much more appealing. So if I, for instance, were armed with these up against 3 guys with spears or long swords or something, then okay, right, so this guy lunges at me. Okay, I parry him, I charge in and go stabby, 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 I'm getting him. But the other 2 will just run in, and stab me, and I'm defenseless against them. Against multiple opponents, you really want something long to keep people back at a distance. Against multiple opponents, you never want them all to be on top of you in a big scrum, because then they'll be able to use their superior numbers and you will lose pretty much every time. So you've got to keep people back and away from you, and the way to do that is with a long weapon. And it's not a coincidence that in big group fights throughout the world, the spear was dominant for a very long time. Pikes for a while, then later halberds, then pikes again for a bit, but spears, pikes, halberds, long things. In the days of the musket, they had long muskets and then long bayonets as they stood in the dense formations, and that's not a coincidence. Group fights favour long weapons. But a duel in the lift, yeah, butterfly sword's pretty handy. Now, one of the problems that I had, you may have noticed, was in initiating an attack. Because always in the Hong Kong Book of Kung Fu, it says that when the brigand throws a punch at you or whatever, then you, the innocent and entirely virtuous martial artist, not a brigand, can counter in some way and then get in there and biff him, win the day, and then go your way in peace. I have noticed that when I meet very keen martial artists, a suspiciously large proportion of them have a suspiciously large treasury of anecdotes, which pretty much all start with, I was minding my own business, coming out of a nightclub on my own one night when 3 guys I'd never seen before in my life, honest, jumped me for no reason whatsoever, and I biffed them up using my whatever martial art that is that I do. And I was always suspicious about this because, you know, I'd done a fair bit of martial arts and no one had ever attacked me out of the blue. How come this never happens to me? And yet it happens to you over and over and over again, and you're always completely innocent. It's almost as though... No, it couldn't be that you were itching to try out your martial arts. No, that couldn't be it. I don't know how to explain it then. But anyway, so in the Hong Kong Book of Kung Fu, he does X, and then you counter with Y, and then biff, 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 win the day. But that means that with these, particularly up against someone with a longer weapon, I'm standing there waiting for him to attack, because I've learned loads of things that I can do if you attack. So, okay, you're coming that way. Okay, in that case I'm going to do that, and then that, or whatever. But I'm waiting for him to launch that attack, because I'm out of measure. If he's in measure, if he's standing at a distance from me, which suits him, so that he can, with one step, launch an attack that actually hits my body, then I can't do the same. I'm out of reach. However, if my opponent is standing there with his sword out in front of him like this at long point, then I can perhaps initiate an attack, because I can knock aside the point of his sword. I'm out of range of him, but I'm not out of range of the point of his sword. I knock aside, step in, control it, and then get him. But you'll notice that Zach sometimes, I don't know how conscious a strategy this was, but for instance, remember when he had a buckler? A couple of times he had the buckler in front of him like this, and then he was standing in this guard position with the sword right back like that. So there's no way I can initiate an attack. If I charged in against him, he could then swing high or medium or low from there, and I wouldn't know until it was probably too late. So that was very wise of him. Now, years ago, when I tried out this in LARP against LARPers almost never have large shields or spears, because those weapons aren't cool and they're awkward to carry around. You know, a hero's weapon is an axe or a sword or a mace. I found that I was just again and again and again parrying the weapon, slicing the wrist, parrying the weapon, slicing the wrist. Whatever angle they came at me, boom, slicey, slicey, slice, I hit the wrist. But of course in LARP, one hit usually doesn't win the fight. Whereas in HEMA bouts, the sport, one hit normally scores a point. So they weren't too worried about it. So they were launching attacks at me, unfamiliar with what I was doing, and getting hit in the wrist over and over again. But here, I wasn't hitting my opponents again and again and again in the wrist. And I think that's because they were better swordsmen. Also, they're a little bit more wary. This is steel, and they know that in HEMA, a single hit wins the bout. So they didn't want to get sliced in the wrist. So they were coming in with lots of flourishes and feints and so forth to avoid being hit in the wrist, and that worked. I did get in a couple of hits on wrists, but it wasn't as though I was hitting wrists over and over and over again. Now, when I was fighting Zach, I felt that his buckler did help when he used the buckler. You do have to know how to use a buckler for it to be of any use. It can actually be a liability, I think, if you don't. I fought lots of people with swords, with shields, and their shields actually were holding them back because they didn't know how to use them. It was just immobilizing part of their body. It was making them less mobile across the ground. And a lot of people with bucklers will swing and try to knock and do big movements like this, in which case you just go slicey slice and slice the inside of the elbow. But he knew what he was doing, and he was standing with his buckler in front of him where it should be, and close, keeping it close to his hands and protecting it. And it was quite effective against these where I'm trying to get in there and slice. It was so a well-used buckler, I think, does work against butterfly swords. Overall, though, against arming sword, I did eventually get the upper hand, particularly against the slightly less experienced and skilled Harry. I think Harry will be all right with my saying that. And I think sometimes I got the upper hand because of the unfamiliarity. This thing has got funny hooks on it, and sometimes I'm doing flourishy movements with it, and I don't know what's going on, he might be thinking. And so there were a couple of times when Harry chopped at me, and then I felt sort of froze a bit while I was suddenly going into Wing Chun mode and doing my stuff. And I think in a real fight where his life was on the line and he was more desperate, he wouldn't have frozen. He would have just kept hacking, and it might have been futile, but it would still have been causing me problems. And so now, next thing is, watching the footage back, I couldn't help but notice that whereas in a HEMA bout, if you score a hit, you score a hit and it's worth a point. If you look at it from say, like a Dungeons and Dragons perspective, it's, oh yeah, okay, this is the number of hits, but how much damage was being done? I felt that I was rolling D10 for my damage, and my opponents were rolling D3 or something, because pretty much every single hit against me didn't come with the longer weapons as a big swing through the air and then a hit with the fast-moving tip. Instead, it would be a draw cut from close in, or I would parry and the tip would bend and just touch me, or I'd get just a little touch on an elbow, or my trousers next to my knee or something. Really, it was all tip here, tap there. Whereas I was, when I was hitting a wrist, okay, I was hitting a wrist reasonably gently because I just have to register a hit. But don't forget, if I go ka-chunk like that, I could go phoom. That could be a rinya. In a real fight, that would have been shoom, a big chop at the wrist, coming through air, shoom, with this deep and reasonably heavy blade shoom, in the wrist. That would really knock the wind out of your attack quite a bit more as well. If I weren't just touching in the wrist, I was really chopping. And then when I was hitting arms, it was again shoom, it was a solid chop to the upper arm, coming in on the outside. When I was hitting a side, again, it was a whoom, big chop into the side. If I chop into your liver, you're going to bleed out very quickly. You've had it. And most of the time, I was getting in there and I was finishing with a centerline attack. So I was controlling his weapon, stepping right in, and yes, okay, I was usually just going cut to the center of his chest like that, which wouldn't do a lot in a real fight, but that's just to register a hit. And we're friends, I'm not trying to hurt anyone, but from here, I could stick that right into your face, into your throat, into your solar plexus. And it's in line with my center line, so I'm getting my body weight right behind that, and it's going straight towards your center line, for a very definite fight finishing stab, chop, whatever. So yes, in terms of number of hits, I definitely was not dominating that fight, particularly against Zach, but in terms of damage dealt, maybe I was actually dominating there. But I should get on now to the thing about which I am most proud, and that is that I kept my style. This needs an explanation. So when I say I kept my style, I don't mean, hey, I looked really cool in my white padded jacket and all that. No. What I mean is that I was using proper Wing Chun. I was actually using Wing Chun throughout. Because something I notice again and again and again is that practitioners of various martial arts lose their style almost completely as soon as a bout becomes competitive. So you have your Shotokan karate guys that are down here in the horse stance. Oh, I'm going to have to come up so you can see my hands. And they're going, whah, and they're practicing their reverse punches like this, and they get this just so, and they do this for hours, and they look really cool. And then when they spar against somebody else in a competitive bout, where you don't want to be hit and it matters that you win, suddenly they turn into boxers. And you think, oh, okay, so your style that you've been practicing for ages, it just goes straight out of the window when you actually put it into a practical bout. And yet with Wing Chun, that doesn't seem to happen. And it didn't happen with me using these. So the way I stood, looking at my opponent through the blades, the way I was stepping, the way I was turning, the way I was parrying and attacking at the same time, the way I was controlling and moving in through the center line, all of that was Wing Chun, pretty much. Yeah, I can't think of a time. All right, some of it maybe wasn't the best Wing Chun, and I'm sure that if some master of these things were to watch this video, he could in the comments point out that I was doing something drastically wrong, and I wouldn't be at all surprised. I was never a master of these. I was just someone who knew Wing Chun and got some swords and gave them a go. But at least when I actually went up against HEMA people, I could, in bout after bout after bout, keep my style. Lindybeige!